The year is 1935. The world is shrinking. In the United States, the Douglas DC-3 has just revolutionized air travel. It is reliable, profitable, and fast. But for the titans of the American aviation industry, United Airlines, TWA, American, Eastern, and Pan Am, the DC-3 was already yesterday's news. They wanted something more. They wanted something bigger. They wanted a machine that could conquer the continent without stopping. They approached Donald Douglas, the visionary founder of Douglas Aircraft Company, with a check for $100,000, a fortune at the time, and a challenge. Build us the ultimate airliner. Douglas accepted. He unleashed his engineers to create a technological marvel that would dwarf anything else in the sky. For 3 years, in a secretive hangar in Santa Monica, California, a metal giant began to take shape. On June 7, 1938, the hangar doors opened and the world gasped. They called it the DC-4E. The E stood for experimental, but it might as well have stood for excessive. It was a behemoth. It was nearly 3 times the size of the DC-3. It featured 4 massive Pratt & Whitney engines. It was the first large airplane to use a tricycle landing gear, sitting level on the ground rather than tilting back like the taildraggers of the era. And most distinctively, it had a massive triple-tail design, 3 vertical stabilizers rising from the rear like shark fins. Inside, it was pure luxury. It was designed to carry 42 passengers by day or 30 in sleeping berths by night. It had a private bridal suite for newlyweds. It had hot and cold running water. It was the first airliner to feature a dedicated auxiliary power unit to run air conditioning while parked on the ground. It was, on paper, the greatest airplane ever built. But when it took to the skies, the dream began to crack. The test pilots reported that the plane flew well enough, but it was complex. Horrifically complex. The electrical systems were a maze of wires that baffled mechanics. The control cables were heavy and unresponsive. Then, the airlines got their hands on it for route testing. United Airlines flew it from coast to coast, hoping to dazzle their customers. The passengers loved the luxury, but the accountants hated the math. The DC-4E was heavy, far heavier than predicted. Because of its weight, the engines had to work harder, guzzling fuel at an alarming rate. It was slow to climb and expensive to maintain. By 1939, the verdict was in. The Big Five airlines came back to Donald Douglas with bad news. They didn't want the DC-4E. It was an economic disaster. They told him to scrap the design and build something simpler, lighter, and cheaper, which eventually became the successful DC-4 Skymaster. But that left Douglas Aircraft in a terrible position. They had spent millions of dollars developing this single prototype. They had poured years of research into a machine that nobody wanted. The DC-4E was now a white elephant, a majestic, impressive, and utterly useless piece of aluminum sitting on the tarmac. Donald Douglas was a businessman. He couldn't just scrap it. He needed to recoup his losses. He needed a buyer who was impressed by size and didn't care about fuel efficiency. He needed a buyer who was looking for a shortcut to heavy aviation dominance. And quietly, across the Pacific Ocean, the Imperial Japanese Navy was watching. Japan was desperate. They were preparing for a war of vast distances across the Pacific. They needed a heavy bomber with 4 engines, something that could carry a massive payload over thousands of miles. But their own aviation industry was lagging behind. They didn't have the know-how to build a heavy airframe from scratch. When they heard that America's largest, most advanced superplane was up for sale, they didn't see a failed airliner. They saw a blueprint for a bomber. The trap was set. Douglas wanted to sell a failure. Japan wanted to buy a miracle. Neither side realized that this transaction would lead to one of the most ironic chapters in military history. By late 1939, the clouds of war were gathering over the Pacific. The United States and Japan were locked in a tense diplomatic stare-down. The U.S. State Department had already begun restricting the export of strategic materials, oil, steel, and weapons to the Japanese Empire. In this climate of suspicion, the sale of a cutting-edge, four-engine American aircraft to Japan should have been impossible. But the Imperial Japanese Navy had a plan, and it relied entirely on the greed of the seller and the gullibility of the government. The Japanese Navy was desperate. Their engineers at the Nakajima Aircraft Company had hit a wall. They knew that the future of aerial warfare lay in long-range heavy bombers, flying fortresses capable of carrying massive payloads over the vast distances of the Pacific Ocean. But they had no experience building such giants. They needed a template. They needed a shortcut. When they heard the Douglas DC-4E was up for sale, they didn't send an admiral to negotiate. They sent men in business suits. The buyers claimed to represent Imperial Japanese Airways, Dai Nippon Koku. Their story was smooth and plausible. We are a civilian airline. We want to upgrade our passenger fleet for long-distance commercial flights across Asia. We admire American luxury. It was a lie wrapped in a contract. The negotiations were delicate. The asking price was staggering, reportedly close to $1 million, equivalent to nearly $22 million today. But the Japanese didn't haggle. They paid cash. Back in Washington, alarms went off. The Munitions Control Board reviewed the sale. Why was Japan buying a plane that contained the most advanced hydraulic and electrical systems in the world? But Douglas Aircraft Company played their card. They argued that the DC-4E was not a military plane. In fact, they argued it was a failure. It was too heavy, too slow, and commercially non-viable for American airlines. They were essentially selling Japan a piece of expensive junk. The U.S. government hesitated, but eventually they shrugged. If the Japanese wanted to waste $1 million on a rejected prototype, let them. The export license was granted. The deception was complete. In late 1939, the massive DC-4E was carefully disassembled in California. The wings were detached, the fuselage crated, and the four mighty Pratt & Whitney engines were packed into boxes. It was loaded onto a freighter bound for Yokohama. The moment the ship docked in Japan, the charade ended. The crates were not taken to a civilian airport. There was no press conference to announce a new era of luxury travel for Japanese citizens. Instead, the cargo was transported under heavy guard directly to the Nakajima Aircraft Company's secret research facility. There, the airliner was subjected to a brutal autopsy. Japanese engineers swarmed over the machine. They weren't interested in the bridal suite or the hot running water. They were interested in the skeleton. They stripped the skin off the wings to study the spar construction. They took apart the hydraulic landing gear, the complex tricycle system that no Japanese plane possessed. They analyzed the superchargers on the engines. This was reverse engineering on a massive scale. The Japanese Navy designated the project the 13 Sure attack bomber. The plan was simple. Copy the Douglas airframe, strip out the luxury, install bomb bays and mount machine gun turrets. They believed they had pulled off the intelligence coup of the century. They believed they had stolen the crown jewel of American aviation right from under the nose of the FBI. But as the Nakajima engineers dug deeper into the American design, they began to realize something terrifying. They had assumed the Americans were selling them a masterpiece. They hadn't realized that the Americans had sold them a lemon. The Japanese were about to build a war machine based on a design that American engineers had already thrown in the trash. The espionage had worked perfectly, but the prize was poisoned. 1940. The Nakajima Aircraft Company factory in Gunma Prefecture. The American DC-4E lay in pieces on the factory floor. It was a dissected corpse. But the orders from the Imperial Navy were clear. Resurrect it. Make it stronger. Make it deadlier. The project was given the designation G5N. The engineers named it Shinzan, meaning deep mountain or mountain recess. It was a name that evoked immovable strength and grandeur. But as the engineers began their work, the project began to resemble Mary Shelley's Frankenstein more than a military triumph. The first problem was the fuselage. The DC-4E was designed for comfort. It was wide, spacious, and pressurized. A bomber does not need comfort. It needs utility. The Japanese engineers sliced into the aluminum skin. Where the bridal suite used to be, they cut a massive hole for a bomb bay. Where the stewardess station stood, they installed ammunition racks. They sawed off the smooth, aerodynamic nose and replaced it with a glass-enclosed greenhouse for a bombardier. They cut holes in the top and tail to install heavy 20mm cannon turrets. They were militarizing a pacifist design. And every time they added a gun or a bomb rack, the weight counter ticked upward. But the fatal mistake wasn't in the airframe. It was in the engines. The original American plane was powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney Hornet engines. They were reliable, though slightly underpowered for such a giant. The Nakajima engineers looked at these American engines and made a decision that would doom the entire project. They decided to perform a heart transplant. They stripped out the proven American machinery and replaced them with domestic engines. The Nakajima NK7A Mamoru. On paper, the Mamoru was powerful, boasting 1,870 horsepower, more than the Americans offered. In reality, the Mamoru was a disaster. It was complex, prone to overheating, and mechanically fragile. It was an experimental engine being put into an experimental airframe. It was a gamble upon a gamble. By the time the prototype was reassembled, it had undergone a grotesque transformation. The sleek lines of the airliner were broken by gun turrets and glass blisters. But the real horror was the physics. The original DC-4E had been rejected by United Airlines because it was too heavy at 61,000 pounds. The new G5N Shinzan, fully loaded with fuel, bombs, ammo, and armor plating, weighed nearly 70,000 pounds. The engineers had taken a plane that was already obese by aviation standards and added another 5 tons of steel and lead. They had increased the weight by nearly 20%, but they had barely improved the lift. The wings, the same wings designed for the lighter airliner, now had to carry a load they were never meant to support. When the Shinzan finally rolled out of the hangar in 1941, it was an awe-inspiring sight. It was the largest aircraft ever built in Japan. It had a wingspan of 138 feet, larger than the American B-17 Flying Fortress, larger than the B-24 Liberator. It looked like a Titan that would crush the U.S. Navy. The Japanese propaganda machine prepared to celebrate. The engineers wiped the grease from their hands, looking up at the monster they had stitched together from American bones and Japanese organs. But looking impressive on the tarmac is not the same as being effective in the air. They had built a mountain, all right, but as they were about to discover, mountains don't fly. The G5N Shinzan was not a bird of prey. It was a brick with wings. The tragedy of the Shinzan wasn't that it couldn't fly. It was that it flew exactly as well as a converted, overweight hotel should be expected to fly. 1941. The Kasumigaura Airfield. The test pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy strapped themselves into the cockpit of the G5N Shinzan. They were the elite men used to the nimble, razor-sharp handling of the Zero fighter. Now they were at the helm of a flying apartment building. The engines roared to life, for massive radials coughing smoke. The brakes were released. The giant began to move, and it kept moving, and moving. To the horror of the observers on the ground, the Shinzan didn't want to leave the earth. It ate up the runway, consuming thousands of feet of asphalt before reluctantly clawing its way into the sky. It didn't soar. It shuddered into the air. Once aloft, the nightmare truly began. The pilots wrestled with the control yokes. The Shinzan was sluggish. It was lethargic. Turning the aircraft required immense physical strength and agonizing patience. It responded to inputs with a delay that was terrifying in a combat scenario. But the real tragedy was the numbers. The Navy had ordered a super bomber. They wanted a range of 4,000 miles. They wanted it to carry 4 tons of bombs. They wanted it to fly high above enemy fighters. The Shinzan failed every single metric. Its top speed was a pathetic 260 miles per hour, and that was without a full bomb load. Loaded down, it was even slower. It was a sitting duck. Any American fighter pilot who spotted it would have considered it target practice. It couldn't climb high enough to escape anti-aircraft fire. Couldn't fly fast enough to outrun a pursuit. And then the engines began to die. The complex Mamoru engines were a disaster. They overheated. They vibrated the airframe until rivets popped. The reliability was so poor that the Navy ordered them to be stripped out and replaced with the weaker, but reliable Mitsubishi Kase engines. The result? The plane became even slower. Meanwhile, across the battle lines, Allied intelligence was having a panic attack. Reconnaissance photos had spotted these massive four-engine giants sitting on Japanese airfields. The Allies were terrified. They believed Japan had built its own version of the B-17 Flying Fortress. They anticipated waves of heavy bombers striking Australia or the U.S. West Coast. In the Allied codenaming system, bombers were given female names. They christened this mysterious giant Liz. American pilots were briefed on the Liz. They were shown silhouettes. They were told to watch out for its heavy armament. But as the months of the war dragged on, a strange thing happened. No Allied pilot ever reported seeing a Liz in combat. No Liz ever dropped a bomb on American troops. The Allies were confused. Where was the monster? The answer was humiliating. The monster was grounded. The Japanese Navy had come to a bitter realization. The Shinzan was simply too terrible to risk in battle. If they sent it against the Americans, it would be a massacre. The plane was so heavy that if it lost a single engine during takeoff, it would crash. If it lost an engine in flight, it couldn't maintain altitude. The mountain had become a molehill. In a desperate attempt to save face, the Navy stripped the G5N of its guns. They removed the bomb sights. They admitted defeat. The aircraft that was supposed to be the sword of the empire was demoted. It would never drop a bomb in anger. The heavy bomber program, born from a stolen American dream, had crashed and burned without ever seeing the enemy. 1943. The Pacific Theater. The war had turned. The Japanese Empire was no longer expanding. It was shrinking, and the great mountain, the G5N Shinzan, had been quietly removed from the front lines of the air war. The Navy High Command had accepted the bitter truth. The Shinzan was a failure as a weapon. But it was still a large airplane, and Japan was starving for transport capacity. So, the engineers performed one final surgery. They stripped out the heavy cannon turrets. They removed the bomb racks. They gutted the interior. The menacing attack bomber was redesignated as the G5N2L. The L stood for transport. It was the ultimate humiliation for a machine built to rain fire upon enemies. The aircraft that was supposed to be Japan's answer to the B-17 Flying Fortress was now a glorified delivery truck. For the remainder of its short life, the Shinzan did not carry bombs to American cities. It carried crates of torpedoes, spare engine parts, and mailbags between the Japanese home islands and bases in the Marianas. It was a dangerous job, not because of enemy fighters, but because the plane itself remained a death trap. The underpowered engines struggled to lift heavy cargo. Maintenance crews hated it. It was a maintenance nightmare, a lingering curse of its complex American origins. One by one, the few existing Shinzans met their end. They didn't go down in glorious dogfights. Some crashed due to mechanical failure. Others were destroyed on the ground, sitting ducks for Allied bombing raids. They were massive, stationary targets, easy prey for the agile American Hellcats and Corsairs roaming the skies. By 1945, as the fires of war burned out, the Shinzan was extinct. When American occupation forces landed in Japan after the surrender, technical intelligence teams began scouring the airfields for advanced technology. At a ruined airfield, they stumbled upon the wreckage of a massive, four-engine plane. The American officers were puzzled. It looked Japanese, but the lines were strangely familiar. They climbed over the rusted wing spars. They looked at the landing gear, the distinctive tricycle gear. They looked at the tail structure. And then they realized the irony. They were looking at the ghost of the Douglas DC-4E. They were looking at the very plane their own country had rejected 7 years earlier. The Japanese had spent millions of yen, wasted thousands of man-hours, and consumed precious strategic materials trying to reverse engineer a mistake. The legacy of the G5N Shinzan is a lesson in the limits of imitation. The Japanese engineers were brilliant, but they were tasked with the impossible: to turn a luxury liner into a battleship without understanding the fundamental flaws of the original design. While the Americans developed the B-29 Superfortress, a plane designed from scratch to be a bomber, which would ultimately devastate Japan, the Japanese Navy had pinned their hopes on a copy. The Shinzan remains a footnote in history, known to aviation enthusiasts as the worst heavy bomber ever built. But it serves as a powerful reminder of a strategic truth. You cannot buy technological superiority. You have to build it. In the end, the deep mountain never cast a shadow over America. It simply cast a long, expensive shadow over the Japanese aviation industry, a monument to a dream that was too heavy to fly.